The champagne glass trembled in Marcus Rivera's hand as his younger brother Derek's laughter cut through the wedding reception noise like broken glass. 20 years of silence, 20 years of swallowed pride, and it all came crashing down in that moment when Derek pointed at him across the crowded ballroom and announced to their cousin's new bride that Marcus was nothing but a fraud who'd been lying about his military service his entire adult life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The string quartet continued playing, oblivious to the social execution happening near the dessert table. Marcus watched as heads turned, as whispers spread through the Rivera family like wildfire. Aunts, uncles, cousins who had respected his quiet dignity for decades now looked at him with questions in their eyes. Derek's wife Sarah nodded knowingly, as if she'd suspected all along. Even their elderly mother, seated at the head table in her wheelchair, tilted her head with confusion etched across her weathered face. Marcus set down his glass with deliberate care, the crystal making barely a sound against the white tablecloth. His hands were steady now, muscle memory from a lifetime of training taking over. The room seemed to slow, sounds becoming muffled, vision sharpening to focus on Derek's smug expression. His brother was enjoying this moment, savoring what he clearly believed was long overdue justice for what he saw as decades of stolen valor. The confrontation had been building for months, though Marcus hadn't seen it coming. Derek had always been the golden child, the one who'd stayed close to home, who'd married young and given their parents grandchildren, who'd built a successful insurance agency in their hometown of Millbrook, Texas. Marcus had been the enigma, disappearing for months at a time with vague explanations about government work, showing up to family gatherings with scars he never explained and a silence that seemed to weigh more than words. Derek stepped closer, his voice carrying over the reception noise with practiced courtroom confidence. He'd been a paralegal for 15 years and knew how to command attention when delivering damaging testimony. The guest formed an unconscious circle around the two brothers, sensing drama unfolding in real time. "You want to know the truth about my big brother Marcus?" Derek announced, his words slightly slurred from the open bar. "The war hero, the mysterious government contractor, the man who's too modest to talk about his service?" He paused for effect, looking around at the gathered family members. "He's been lying to all of you for 20 years. I hired a private investigator 3 months ago, and you know what we found? Nothing. No military records, no service history, no deployments. Marcus Rivera never served a day in the armed forces." The accusation hit the assembled family like a physical blow. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. Marcus's sister Elena dropped her purse, the contents scattering across the polished floor. Their father's brother, Uncle Roberto, who'd served in Vietnam and had always treated Marcus with the special respect reserved for fellow veterans, took a step backward as if he'd been slapped. Derek reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I've got the investigator's report right here. Social security records, tax filings, everything. Marcus graduated high school in 1988 and then just vanished from public records for 4 years. No college enrollment, no military service, nothing. Then he magically reappeared in 1992, claiming to work for some classified government agency that conveniently can't be verified." Marcus felt the familiar weight of operational security pressing down on his chest. 20 years of living a necessary lie, of watching his family struggle to understand why he couldn't share details about his work, why he missed birthdays and holidays, why he sometimes showed up looking like he'd been through hell.
Couldn't explain where he'd been. The truth was classified at levels so high that even acknowledging certain programs existed could result in federal prosecution. Sarah, Derek's wife, stepped forward with a satisfied expression. She'd never liked Marcus, had always resented the way the family treated him with the deference she felt was unearned. "I told Derek to look into it," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom. "It never made sense to me. A man who claims to be a veteran but never talks about his service, never goes to VA hospitals, never connects with other veterans. Real soldiers don't act like that." The crowd murmured agreement. Several family members nodded, pieces of a puzzle they'd never been able to solve suddenly seeming to click into place. Marcus's mysterious absences, his reluctance to discuss his work, his strange injuries that he attributed to training accidents, all of it now reframed through the lens of suspected deception. Their mother wheeled her chair closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, mijo, tell them they're wrong. Tell them about your medals, about the missions you can't discuss. Tell them about the nightmares that wake you up screaming when you think no one can hear." Her words carried the weight of a mother who'd watched her son struggle with demons he couldn't name, who'd held him during rare moments of vulnerability when the facade cracked just enough to let the pain show through. Derek laughed again, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Nightmares? Mom, he's been playing you for decades. Those scars he won't explain? Probably from bar fights or accidents he's too embarrassed to admit. The mysterious government job? I'm betting he's been working construction or warehouse jobs and lying about everything else." Marcus looked around the room at faces he'd known his entire life. His cousin Maria, whose wedding they were celebrating, looked stricken. Her new husband, a genuine Army veteran who'd served 3 tours in Iraq, watched with interest and suspicion. The younger cousins, kids who'd grown up hearing whispered stories about Uncle Marcus and his secret missions, stared with a mixture of confusion and betrayal. 20 years, Derek continued, warming to his theme. 20 years of stolen valor, of taking credit for sacrifices he never made, of accepting respect he never earned. Do you know how many real veterans struggle every day while frauds like my brother parade around pretending to be heroes? The private investigator's report crinkled as Derek unfolded it, though he didn't read from it directly. Marcus knew what it would say because he knew exactly what his official record looked like to anyone without the proper clearance levels. According to every public database, every accessible government file, Marcus Rivera had indeed disappeared from traceable society for 4 years after high school graduation, then reappeared working for a series of government contractors with vague job descriptions and travel patterns that made no obvious sense. Elena, Marcus's younger sister, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Marcus, please, just tell us the truth. If Derek's wrong, show us something, anything that proves you served. You've been our family's quiet hero for so long. Don't let it end like this." The plea in her voice almost broke his resolve. Elena had been 8 years old when he'd left for what the family believed was basic training. She'd grown up writing letters to her big brother, the soldier, drawing pictures of him in uniform, telling her friends at school about her hero brother who fought the bad guys in places so dangerous he couldn't even tell them where. Now, she was 38 years old, a mother of 3, and learning that the foundation of her childhood admiration might have been built on lies. Marcus felt the operational protocols warring with family loyalty in his chest. The classification level of his actual service was so high that even retired personnel faced severe consequences for unauthorized disclosure. His work hadn't been military in the traditional sense, but it had been far more dangerous.
And far more classified than anything Derek could imagine. He'd operated in places that didn't officially exist, conducting missions that would never appear in any public record, serving his country in ways that required absolute secrecy, even decades later. But how could he explain that to a roomful of civilians without violating federal law? How could he make them understand that some service to country happened in shadows so deep that even family had to be kept in the dark? Derek sensed his advantage and pressed forward. "You know what the saddest part is? All these years, I've been defending you. When people asked why my successful brother never talks about his military career, I told them he was just humble. When they wondered why you never showed up in dress uniform for family events, I said you preferred to keep your service private. I've been your biggest supporter, and it turns out I've been defending a lie." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Marcus had never worn a military uniform to family gatherings because his actual service had never involved traditional military uniforms. His dress had been civilian clothes that allowed him to blend into whatever environment an operation required. His medals weren't the kind displayed in shadow boxes and suburban living rooms. They were the kind that came with classification levels and non-disclosure agreements that lasted lifetimes. Uncle Roberto, the Vietnam veteran who'd treated Marcus like a brother-in-arms for decades, spoke up with barely controlled anger. If this is true, Marcus, you've dishonored every man and woman who ever put on the uniform. You've spat on the graves of people who died for this country while you were playing pretend. The words hit harder than any physical blow Marcus had ever taken. Roberto had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had come home to protests and hatred, had struggled with his own demons from real combat. The idea that his respect had been based on a lie was clearly devastating to the older man. Marcus's silence stretched longer, each passing second seeming to confirm Derek's accusations in the minds of those watching. He'd spent so long living in the gray areas between truth and necessary deception that he'd forgotten how to navigate normal family dynamics. His work had required absolute compartmentalization, treating even his loved ones as potential security risks who needed to be protected from dangerous knowledge. The classification levels that governed his past weren't arbitrary bureaucratic red tape. They existed because the knowledge he carried could get people killed, could compromise ongoing operations, could destabilize international relationships that most civilians didn't even know existed. His silence hadn't been about modesty or trauma, though both existed. It had been about operational security that transcended personal relationships. Derek pulled out his phone, scrolling to what appeared to be the digital version of the investigator's report. I've got documentation going back 30 years. Tax records, employment records, address histories. Everything points to Marcus being a fraud who's been living off the respect earned by real heroes. The crowd pressed closer, everyone wanting to see the evidence that would finally solve the mystery of Marcus Rivera. Sarah nodded approvingly, clearly relishing what she saw as vindication of years of suspicion. Even some of the wedding guests who barely knew the family were drawn in by the drama unfolding before them. Marcus looked at his mother, sitting in her wheelchair with confusion and pain etched across her face. She'd been the one to drive him to the recruitment station 22 years ago, though what happened next wasn't anything either of them could have anticipated at the time. His recruitment hadn't been for any branch of the traditional military. It had been for something that existed in the spaces between official agencies, something that recruited from military hopefuls but operated under different rules entirely. The weight of 2 decades of necessary lies pressed down on him. Every missed holiday.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Explained away with cover stories, every scar attributed to training accidents that had actually been combat injuries, every nightmare dismissed as stress from his mysterious job when they were actually flashbacks to operations in places that didn't appear on any map. He'd protected his family from the truth, but in doing so, he'd made himself vulnerable to exactly this kind of accusation. Derek's voice carried across the ballroom with growing confidence. I think the real question now is what we do about this. Does the family continue to enable this fraud, or do we finally hold Marcus accountable for 20 years of lies? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Marcus felt the familiar tactical assessment kicking in, analyzing the situation from every angle. His cover had been blown, not by enemy operatives or security breaches, but by his own brother's suspicion and a private investigator's surface-level research. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd survived operations in hostile territory only to be taken down at a family wedding in suburban Texas. But Derek had made one crucial mistake in his investigation. He'd looked for traditional military service records, the kind that would show up in Department of Defense databases accessible to private investigators. He hadn't looked deep enough to find the records that existed in classified systems, protected by levels of security clearance that most people didn't even know existed. The classification protocols that had kept Marcus silent for 20 years were still in effect. Even now, facing public humiliation and family rejection, he couldn't simply reveal the truth without risking federal prosecution. The programs he'd served under had been so sensitive that many of them had been officially denied even to congressional oversight committees. But there was one piece of evidence, one item that could prove his service without compromising operational security. It was locked in a safe deposit box 300 miles away, something he'd hoped never to need but had kept as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The problem was getting to it without further damaging his family relationships or raising questions he still couldn't answer. Marcus made his decision with the same calculated precision that had kept him alive through operations most people couldn't imagine. He would retrieve the proof Derek demanded, but he would do it on his own terms. The truth, when it came out, would be overwhelming and undeniable. But it would also raise questions about who Marcus Rivera really was and what he'd actually done for his country during those missing years. The wedding reception continued around them, but the celebration had been poisoned by suspicion and accusation. Family members whispered amongst themselves, taking sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Marcus knew that retrieving the evidence would vindicate him, but it would also change everything. Once certain truths came to light, there would be no going back to the comfortable lie of being a mysterious government contractor. He looked around the room one more time, memorizing faces that might never look at him the same way again. Then he walked toward the exit, ignoring Derek's calls for him to stay and face the consequences of his alleged deception. The real consequences were yet to come, and they would be far more devastating than anything his brother could imagine. The drive to Dallas would take him 6 hours, but it would give him time to prepare for what came next. Time to decide exactly how much truth his family could handle and how much he was willing to risk to restore his honor. The metal waiting in that safe deposit box wasn't just proof of his service. It was proof of the kind of service that would make Derek's accusations seem laughably naive. But it was also proof of secrets that had been kept for national security reasons, secrets that would raise questions about operations that officially never happened and missions that required a different kind of heroism than the ones celebrated in parades and ceremonies. Marcus Rivera was about
To stop being the mysterious brother and become something far more complicated and dangerous to know. The interstate stretched endlessly ahead of Marcus as he drove through the Texas night, his rental car cutting through darkness that seemed to mirror the void his brother had torn in their family. The wedding reception was now 4 hours behind him, but Derek's laughter still echoed in his mind like shrapnel from an explosion he hadn't seen coming. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m., and Dallas was still 2 hours away. His phone had buzzed 17 times since leaving Millbrook, each notification representing another family member demanding explanations he couldn't give. Elena had sent 3 text messages, each more desperate than the last. His mother had tried calling twice before someone, probably Derek, had convinced her that Marcus needed space to figure out how to confess his deceptions. Even Uncle Roberto had sent a message, a single line that cut deeper than any wound Marcus had sustained in the field. "I trusted you like a brother. How could you dishonor us all?" The GPS directed him toward downtown Dallas, toward the Federal Reserve Building where his safe deposit box waited in the basement vault of First National Security Bank. The institution catered to clients who needed discretion and security beyond what normal banks provided. Government contractors, intelligence operatives, people whose lives required compartmentalization that civilian institutions couldn't understand or accommodate. Marcus had established the account in 1994, 2 years into his service with an organization that didn't officially exist. The box contained documents and items too sensitive to keep in any normal location, too dangerous to his family's safety if discovered, but too important to his own protection to destroy. He'd hoped never to need what was waiting in that reinforced steel compartment, but Derek's public accusation had forced his hand. The city lights grew brighter as he approached downtown Dallas. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, just a few late-night workers and early-morning commuters beginning their routines. Marcus parked in the secured garage beneath the bank building, his keycard still active after all these years. The elevator descended to the vault level, where armed security guards maintained round-the-clock protection for clients who paid premium rates for absolute discretion. The guard on duty was someone Marcus recognized from previous visits, though they'd never exchanged more than professional courtesies. Government contractors learned early not to ask questions about each other's business, understanding that some knowledge was dangerous to possess. The man simply verified Marcus's identification and biometric signatures before escorting him to the vault area. Box 4471 was one of the larger units, designed to hold more than documents and jewelry. Marcus inserted his key and underwent the retinal scan that provided secondary verification of his identity. The steel door swung open silently, revealing contents that represented 20 years of a life lived in shadows most people couldn't imagine.
The Medal of Honor rested in a custom foam-lined case, its blue ribbon and gold star seemingly glowing under the vault's harsh fluorescent lighting. Beside it lay the citation, signed by a president whose name would make headlines if his involvement in certain operations ever became public knowledge. The medal wasn't the traditional version most Americans would recognize from ceremonies and parades. This was a classified variant, awarded for actions so sensitive that the recipient's identity remained classified indefinitely. Marcus lifted the case with hands that remembered the weight of responsibility it represented. The medal had been presented in a ceremony attended by fewer than 12 people, held in a room that didn't appear on any building schematics, witnessed by officials who would deny the meeting had ever occurred if questioned under oath. The citation accompanying it told a story
would never appear in official military histories, describing actions taken in a country that didn't exist on public maps during a conflict that was never declared. Beneath the medal case lay other items Derek's investigation had missed. Photographs from operations that had been officially erased. Commendation letters from agency directors whose names were classified above top-secret levels. Medical records documenting injuries sustained in places where American personnel had never officially been deployed. The collection painted a picture of service that transcended traditional military categories, of sacrifice made in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The drive back to Millbrook began as the sun rose over East Texas, casting long shadows across farmland that looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Marcus cupped the metal case on the passenger seat, its presence both vindication and burden. Revealing it would prove Derek wrong, but it would also shatter the carefully constructed cover story that had protected not just his own identity, but the identities of everyone he'd worked with over 2 decades. His phone rang as he passed through Tyler, Elena's name appearing on the display. He let it go to voicemail, not ready to explain what was coming. The voicemail she left was heartbroken, pleading for him to call back and tell her that Derek was wrong, that the brother she'd idolized hadn't been lying to them for 20 years. Her pain was audible even through the digital compression, a reminder of how deeply his necessary deceptions had wounded people who had no idea they were living with classified information. The second call came from Derek himself, his voice triumphant and vindictive. "I know you're listening to this, Marcus. Running away doesn't change anything. The whole family knows the truth now. Mom's devastated, Elena's in tears, and Uncle Roberto is talking about having you banned from family gatherings. You can't hide from this forever." The message continued for another minute, Derek detailing how he planned to expose Marcus's alleged fraud to the broader veteran community in Millbrook. He'd already contacted the local VFW post, where Marcus had occasionally attended events but never claimed membership. The plan was systematic character assassination, designed to strip away not just family respect, but community standing as well. Marcus deleted the message without listening to the end. Derek's thoroughness in his investigation was impressive, but it was also about to become his downfall. The private investigator had done surface-level research, accessing databases that were designed to provide plausible deniability for people in Marcus's position. The real records existed in systems so classified that acknowledging their existence could trigger federal investigations. By noon, Marcus was back in Millbrook, driving through streets where he'd grown up but had never really belonged. The town had grown since his youth, with new subdivisions and shopping centers, but the core remained unchanged. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputations were built over generations and destroyed in single conversations. He drove past Derek's insurance office, noting the late-model BMW parked in the reserve space out front. His brother had built a successful business serving the agricultural and oil communities around Millbrook, establishing himself as a pillar of local society. The contrast between Derek's public success and Marcus's mysterious absences had always been a source of tension, but now it had erupted into open warfare. The Rivera family home sat on Maple Street, the same 2-story house where they'd all grown up. The driveway was full of cars, indicating a family meeting was already in progress.
Minutes, studying the house where he'd learned about honor and duty from parents who'd immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination and faith in the American dream. His father had worked 2 jobs to put all 3 children through school, never imagining that his eldest son would end up serving his adopted country in ways that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. The front door opened and Derek emerged, followed by Sarah and several other family members. They stood on the porch talking in animated whispers, occasionally gesturing toward the street where Marcus sat in his car. Derek spotted him first, his expression shifting from surprise to anger as he realized his older brother had returned to face the accusations. Marcus got out of the car, carrying the metal case in a plain manila envelope. He crossed the street with measured steps, his bearing unconsciously shifting into the alert posture that years of dangerous work had ingrained as second nature. The family members on the porch fell silent as he approached, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity, anger, and disappointment. "I wondered when you'd show up," Derek said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Ready to finally tell the truth about your fake military career?" Marcus stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at faces he'd known his entire life. Elena stood behind Derek, her eyes red from crying. Uncle Roberto leaned against the porch rail, his Vietnam veteran's cap worn with the pride Marcus had always respected. Their mother sat in her wheelchair near the door, looking frailer than he'd ever seen her. "I've brought something to show you," Marcus said simply, holding up the envelope. "Something that should answer Derek's questions about my service." Derek laughed, the same bitter sound that had started this confrontation at the wedding. "More fake documents? Another government contractor letter that can't be verified? We're past that, Marcus. The family deserves the truth." "The family deserves the truth," Marcus agreed. "But Derek, you need to understand that some truths come with consequences you haven't considered." Sarah stepped forward, her expression showing the satisfaction of someone believed vindication was at hand. "What consequences? Finally being held accountable for lying to people who loved you?" Marcus looked directly at her, his voice taking on the flat, professional tone that had once intimidated foreign intelligence operatives. "The consequences of learning that some people serve their country in ways that can't be discussed at family dinners, Sarah. The consequences of discovering that classification levels exist to protect not just national security, but the safety of families who don't need to know what their sons and brothers do in the shadows." The envelope crinkled as he opened it, removing the metal case with careful deliberation. The morning sun caught the gold and blue ribbon as he held it up for everyone to see. The effect was immediate and stunning. Uncle Roberto straightened as if struck by lightning, his eyes widening in recognition. Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Even Derek took a step backward, his confident expression faltering. "This is the Medal of Honor," Marcus said quietly, "awarded for actions taken in a classified operation that I still cannot discuss in detail even 20 years later. The citation is signed by a president who cannot publicly acknowledge my existence, presented in a ceremony that never officially occurred." The silence on the porch was absolute. Uncle Roberto removed his cap, an automatic gesture of respect that transcended family dynamics. Elena reached out tentatively, as if afraid to touch something so sacred. Derek's face had gone pale, his private investigator's report suddenly seeming inadequate and foolish. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed truth. "Derek, your investigator found exactly what he was supposed to find. A man who disappeared from public records for 4 years, then reappeared working for government contractors with job descriptions that don't make sense to civilian researchers. That's called operational security, and it's designed to protect not just operatives like me, but families like ours." He handed the metal case to Uncle Roberto, who received it with hands that trembled slightly. The older veteran examined metal with the reverence of someone who understood its significance, reading the classified citation with growing amazement and horror at what it implied about Marcus's service. "Jesus Christ," Roberto whispered. "Marcus, this is real. This is the highest honor this country can bestow, and it's classified at levels I've never even heard of." Derek's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "That could be fake. Anyone can buy military medals online." Marcus reached into the envelope and pulled out additional documents. "These are commendation letters from agency directors whose names are classified above top secret. Medical records documenting injuries sustained in operations that officially never happened. Photographs from missions in countries where American personnel were never deployed." He spread the documents on the porch table,
each one representing a piece of a puzzle that told a story of service beyond anything Derek had imagined. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed, and impossible to fabricate. More importantly, it carried classification markings that would be federal crimes to reproduce without authorization. Elena approached slowly, studying the documents with growing wonder and horror. Marcus, these dates, these places, some of this was happening when we thought you were just traveling for work. You were in actual combat zones doing things that could have gotten you killed. Some of it did nearly get me killed, Marcus replied. The scars Derek mentioned, the nightmares Mom knows about, the long absences that made me miss birthdays and holidays, all of it was real. But I couldn't tell you because knowing the truth would have made you targets. Sarah's confidence had evaporated completely. She stared at the medal with the expression of someone realizing she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Derek picked up one of the commendation letters, reading it with growing comprehension of how wrong his investigation had been. Uncle Roberto handed the medal case back to Marcus with careful reverence. Son, I owe you an apology. We all do. I've been a soldier, and I thought I understood what service meant, but this, he gestured toward the documents, this is service at a level I never imagined existed. The front door opened and their mother wheeled herself onto the porch, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She looked up at Marcus with eyes that held 20 years of questions finally getting answers. Mijo, all these years, all the worry, all the times I thought you were in trouble or running from something, you were actually serving our country in ways I couldn't understand. Marcus knelt beside her wheelchair, his voice gentle. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, Mama. The classification levels required absolute secrecy. Even now, showing you this medal could result in federal prosecution if the wrong people find out. Derek was still reading through the documents, his face showing the progression from skepticism to understanding to horror at the implications. Marcus, some of these operations, if they became public knowledge, they would cause international incidents. The president would have to deny everything. That's exactly right, Marcus confirmed. Which is why I've lived the life I've lived, why I couldn't be the brother you wanted me to be, why I missed family gatherings, why I couldn't explain my scars or my nightmares or my work. The people I served with, the operations we conducted, the places we went, all of it remains classified at levels that make my personal relationships irrelevant to national security. Elena was crying again, but these were different tears. I thought you didn't trust us enough to share your life. I thought you considered yourself too good for
Family. But you were protecting us. Every classified detail I didn't share was protection, Marcus explained. Every vague answer about my work was operational security. Every time I seemed distant or secretive, I was following protocols designed to keep you safe from people who would use you to get to me. The family members who had gathered to discuss Marcus's alleged fraud were now grappling with a reality far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. The mysterious brother wasn't a fraud. He was a genuine American hero whose service had been so classified that even his Medal of Honor couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Derek set down the last document he'd been reading, his hands shaking slightly. Marcus, I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting the family from a fraud. I had no idea I was attacking a genuine war hero. I'm not a war hero, Derek. I'm someone who did jobs that needed doing, in places most people don't know exist, for reasons that can't be publicly discussed. The Medal of Honor represents just one operation out of dozens that will never appear in any history book. Sarah approached tentatively, her earlier hostility replaced by something approaching awe and terror. Marcus, the things in these documents, the places you've been, the people you've worked with, how do you live with secrets like this? Very carefully, Marcus replied, and with the understanding that some prices are worth paying for the security of people you love. Your safety, your normal lives, your ability to sleep peacefully at night, all of that was worth my silence. Uncle Roberto spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served in combat. Marcus, I want you to know that what you've done, the sacrifices you've made,
They honor not just our family, but every veteran who's ever served this country. The fact that you couldn't be recognized publicly makes your service even more meaningful. The morning sun had climbed higher while they talked, casting shorter shadows across the porch where a family was reconstructing their understanding of one of their own. The revelation of Marcus's true service record had shifted the entire dynamic of relationships that had been strained by decades of necessary secrecy. Elena wiped her eyes and looked directly at her older brother. What happens now? Can you finally tell us about your life, or does the classification continue? Marcus carefully gathered the documents back into their envelope, the weight of decades of secrecy still pressing on his shoulders. Some of it remains classified indefinitely. Some operations will never be declassified because acknowledging them would compromise ongoing security interests. But now that you know the basic truth, maybe we can have a different kind of relationship. Derek stepped closer, his voice heavy with regret. Marcus, I've destroyed your reputation in this town. I've told people you were a fraud, contacted the VFW, spread rumors throughout the community. How do we fix that? We don't, Marcus replied simply. The people who need to believe I'm a fraud will continue believing it. The people who matter will eventually understand the truth. That's how classified service works, Derek. Most people never know, and that's by design. Their mother reached up from her wheelchair to take Marcus's hand. Mijo, I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't understand why you had to be so secretive. Now I know you were protecting us from a world we couldn't handle knowing about. The family meeting that had begun as a confrontation about fraud had transformed into something resembling a reconciliation, though Marcus knew the full implications would take time to process. His brothers and sister would need to adjust to understanding that the mysterious family member they'd sometimes resented was actually someone who served his country at the highest levels. As the immediate shock wore off, practical questions began emerging. Elena wanted to know if Marcus was safe now that his cover had been partially blown. Derek wondered if revealing the medal would trigger any
kind of federal investigation. Uncle Roberto asked about other veterans Marcus might have served with, people whose own classifications might be compromised by association. Marcus answered what he could while maintaining the operational security that had governed his life for 2 decades. Some questions would never have answers that could be shared with civilians, even family members who now knew more than most people would ever learn about his service. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking questions and Marcus providing what information he could within the bounds of security protocols that remained in effect. By the time people began leaving, the dynamic of the Rivera family had fundamentally changed. The mysterious brother was no longer a source of resentment or suspicion. He was a source of pride and, frankly, a little fear at the implications of what his service had involved. Derek was the last to leave, approaching Marcus with an expression of deep regret and newfound respect. I don't know how to make this right, Marcus. I've spent months investigating you, questioning your integrity, encouraging other people to doubt you, and all the while you were carrying secrets that would probably get me killed if I knew too much about them. Marcus clasped his brother's shoulder, the gesture carrying forgiveness that words couldn't adequately express. Derek, you did what you thought was right with the information you had. You couldn't have known that some service can't be verified through normal channels. You couldn't have known that my silence was operational security, not deception. But I should have trusted you. I should have trusted the brother I grew up with instead of hiring investigators to dig into your life. Maybe, Marcus agreed. But now you know why trust was never really an option. The classification levels I've lived under don't allow for trust based on family relationships. They require professional compartmentalization that supersedes personal bonds. Derek nodded, beginning to understand the isolation that had defined Marcus's adult life. Is it over now? Can you finally have a normal relationship with your family? Marcus looked around the porch where he'd grown up, considering the question that had no simple answer. Derek, showing you that medal was a violation of federal security protocols. Even now, having this conversation puts all of us at potential risk if the wrong people decide we know too much about classified operations. The implication hung in the air between them. Marcus had chosen family over operational security, but the choice came with consequences that would ripple through all their lives. The truth had been revealed, but truth in the intelligence world was never without costs. As Derek drove away, Marcus remained on the porch with his mother, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. 20 years of necessary lies had been replaced with dangerous truths, and neither of them was entirely certain what would come next. The Medal of Honor sat in its case on the table between them, a symbol of service that few Americans would ever see or understand. It represented not just Marcus's heroism, but the hidden sacrifices made by people whose names would never appear in history books, whose service would never be publicly acknowledged, whose families would never fully understand the prices paid for national security. For the first time in decades, Marcus Rivera felt the weight of operational security beginning to lift from his shoulders. The revelation would have consequences, but it also restored something precious that had been lost in years of necessary deception. His family knew who he really was, and despite the dangers that knowledge brought, it felt like the beginning of a freedom he'd never expected to experience. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the lobby of the federal building in Austin, waiting for an appointment he'd hoped never to have. The summons had arrived by courier, delivered to his apartment, with instructions that left no room for negotiation. Deputy Director Director Walsh of the Defense Intelligence Agency wanted to discuss his recent disclosure of classified materials to unauthorized personnel, namely his family members who lacked appropriate security clearances. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave him time to prepare for what would likely be a career-ending conversation. Revealing the Medal of Honor and associated documents had been a calculated risk, one that might cost him his security clearance and potentially result in federal prosecution. But Derek's public accusations had forced his hand, leaving him with a choice between protecting operational security and protecting his family honor. Director Walsh's office overlooked downtown Austin, its windows providing a view of the state capitol building, where politicians made decisions about operations they would never fully understand. The woman behind the desk was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that marked someone who had risen quickly through the intelligence community ranks. "Colonel Rivera," she began, using his unofficial rank from operations that had never appeared in official military records. "We need to discuss your recent breach of classification protocols at what I understand was a family wedding reception." Marcus took the offered seat across from her desk, noting the files spread before her that contained information about his entire operational history. "Ma'am, I understand the seriousness of what I disclosed. My brother had hired a private investigator and was publicly accusing me of stolen valor. The family situation had become untenable." Director Walsh studied him with eyes that had probably interrogated foreign agents and domestic threats. "Colonel, you understand that operational security doesn't include exceptions for family disputes. The classification levels governing your service record exist for reasons that transcend personal relationships." "Yes, ma'am. I also understand that allowing false accusations of stolen valor to stand would have compromised my cover identity and potentially expose other operatives who worked with me over the years." She opened one of the files, revealing photographs from operations that Marcus remembered with crystal clarity, despite their classified status. "Your service record is remarkable, Colonel. 12 years of active operations across 4 continents. Successful completion of missions that prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted enemy intelligence networks, and protected American interest in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged." Marcus waited, understanding that the praise was leading towards something more complicated. Director Walsh had not summoned him to Austin simply to discuss his distinguished service record. There were larger issues at play, consequences that extended beyond family dynamics or security breaches. "However," she continued, "your decision to reveal classified materials to civilian family members has created a security situation that requires immediate attention. Your brother Derek has been asking questions, conducting follow-up research, trying to understand the full scope of what you showed him. The news didn't surprise Marcus, though it did concern him. Derek's investigative instincts, the same ones that had led to the original accusations, were now focused on understanding the truth about his brother's classified service. That curiosity could lead into areas that would be dangerous for everyone involved. "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Director Walsh turned her computer monitor toward him, displaying Derek's recent internet search history and email communications that had apparently been under surveillance since the wedding reception incident. He's been researching classification levels, trying to understand how someone can receive the Medal of Honor without public acknowledgement. He's contacted congressional offices asking about oversight of intelligence operations. He's even reached out to journalists who specialize in national
security reporting. The implications were staggering. Derek's attempt to understand his brother's service was inadvertently threatening operational security that protected not just Marcus, but dozens of other operatives whose identities remained classified. His civilian brother was stumbling into areas where curiosity could get people killed. "Ma'am, Derek doesn't understand the implications of what he's doing. He's trying to make sense of information he's not equipped to process. He needs guidance, not surveillance." "That's why you're here, Colonel. We need your help to contain the situation before it escalates into something that compromises active operations. Your brother's inquiries have already triggered security reviews at 3 different agencies." Marcus felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling on his shoulders. Even in what should have been retirement from active service, the demands of national security were pulling him back into a world where personal relationships were secondary to protecting classified information. Director Walsh continued, pulling up additional files that showed the scope of the problem. "Your revelation at the wedding was witnessed by approximately 30 family members and wedding guests. Since then, word has spread through your hometown community. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars post is asking questions. A reporter from the Millbrook Gazette has been making inquiries about your military service." The situation was metastasizing beyond family boundaries, creating exactly the kind of public attention that classification protocols were designed to prevent. Marcus realized that his attempt to protect his honor had inadvertently created a security crisis that could expose operations spanning decades. "What are you asking me to do, ma'am?" "We need you to manage this situation, Colonel. Use your relationship with your family to redirect their curiosity, discourage further investigation, and help us maintain the operational security that protects ongoing missions." Marcus understood the implicit message. The government was asking him to lie to his family again, to somehow convince them that their newfound knowledge should not be explored or discussed. After finally revealing the truth about his service, he was being asked to obscure it once more. "Director Walsh, I spent 20 years lying to my family to protect operational security. That deception nearly destroyed my relationship with people I love. I'm not sure I can ask them to accept partial truths after showing them evidence of my actual service." She leaned forward, her expression showing the kind of intensity that marked someone delivering critical information. "Colonel, let me explain what's at stake. The operations you participated in between 1990 and 2004 involved assets who are still active in hostile territories, intelligence networks that remain operational, cover identities that protect American operatives currently working in places where discovery would mean torture and execution." The weight of that information settled over Marcus like a physical burden. His service hadn't ended when he'd transitioned to civilian life. The networks he'd helped establish, the assets he'd recruited, the operations he'd participated in, all of them remained active components of ongoing intelligence activities. Your family's curiosity, however well-intentioned, could lead to discoveries that compromise active operations. Derek's research is already approaching areas that could expose current operatives. We need your help to redirect his attention without creating additional suspicion. Marcus considered the impossible position he'd been placed in. Protecting his honor required revealing classified information.
Protecting active operations now required convincing his family to stop seeking the truth they'd finally been shown. The circular nature of the security requirements felt like a trap with no clean exit. "What are you asking me to do, ma'am?" "We need you to manage this situation, Colonel. Use your relationship with your family to redirect their curiosity, discourage further investigation, and help us maintain the operational security that protects ongoing missions."
Convince your brother that further research would be dangerous for him personally. Help him understand that some knowledge carries risks he's not prepared to handle. Redirect his curiosity toward aspects of your service that won't compromise ongoing operations. Marcus opened the folder, finding detailed psychological profiles of his family members and suggested approaches for managing their reactions to classified information. The thoroughness of the analysis was disturbing, indicating that his family had been under surveillance for longer than just the 3 weeks since the wedding incident. "Have you been monitoring my family before this situation developed? Colonel, anyone with your level of security clearance has family members who are periodically assessed for potential security risks. It's standard protocol, not personal targeting." The revelation added another layer of violation to Marcus's sense of having failed to protect his loved ones. Not only had his service required lying to them for decades, but it had also subjected them to government surveillance they'd never known existed. "Ma'am, I need to ask directly, are you threatening my family if I don't cooperate with this containment strategy?" Director Walsh's expression softened slightly, showing perhaps the first hint of personal empathy since the meeting began. "Colonel, we're not threatening anyone. We're asking for your help to protect people you care about from knowledge that could put them in danger. Derek's research is leading him toward information that hostile intelligence services would kill to obtain." Marcus closed the folder, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that had served him through dangerous operations. "Director Walsh, I understand the security implications. I also understand that my family deserves honesty after decades of necessary deception. I'll speak with Derek, but I won't lie to him again. What will you tell him? The truth he can handle, that some knowledge is dangerous, that further research could put him and others at risk, that the information he's already seen should be treated as a family secret that never gets discussed outside our immediate circle." Director Walsh nodded slowly, apparently accepting that approach as the best available option. "Colonel, we'll be monitoring the situation to ensure it doesn't escalate further. Your family's safety depends on their discretion regarding information they've already learned." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus's family would be protected as long as they remained quiet about what they'd discovered. Further investigation or public discussion could result in consequences that were being left deliberately vague. Marcus stood to leave, then paused at the office door. "Ma'am, one more question. Is my security clearance being revoked because of this incident? That depends on how effectively you manage the containment of information that's already been disclosed. Your service record is too valuable to discard unless the security breach becomes unmanageable." The drive back to Millbrook gave Marcus 3 hours to consider how to approach the most difficult conversation of his life. He needed to convince Derek to stop researching information that could compromise active operations while somehow maintaining the trust that had been restored after the Medal of Honor revelation. He found Derek at his insurance office, staying late to catch up on work that had been neglected during the family crisis. His brother looked up from paperwork with an expression that combined relief and curiosity, clearly hoping for more information about Marcus's classified service. "Marcus, I'm glad you're here. I've been doing research since our conversation at Mom's house, trying to understand the scope of what you were involved in. I have so many questions." Marcus took a seat across from Derek's desk, noting the printed articles and government website printouts that indicated his brother had indeed been conducting the kind of research that had triggered federal attention. "Derek, that's what I need to talk to you about."
Research? The questions? The investigation you're doing? Derek leaned forward eagerly. "I've learned incredible things, Marcus. Classifications I never knew existed, operations that are barely acknowledged even in official histories. Your service was at levels most people can't imagine." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus interrupted gently. "The things you're learning, the questions you're asking,
They're approaching areas that could be dangerous for you to know about. Derek's expression shifted from enthusiasm to confusion. Dangerous how? It's just historical research about my own brother's military service. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Derek the text message he received from Director Walsh after leaving Austin. It contained a list of Derek's recent internet searches, email communications, and phone calls, all documented with timestamps and IP addresses that proved comprehensive surveillance. Derek, this is what I received today from a federal agency. They've been monitoring your research since the wedding. They know every website you visited, every person you've contacted, every question you've asked about my service record. The color drained from Derek's face as he scrolled through the surveillance data. They're watching me? Monitoring my communications? Marcus, this is like something out of a spy movie. It's not a movie, Derek. It's the reality of how classification systems work. The information I showed you at Mom's house came with security implications that extend far beyond our family. Your curiosity about my service is inadvertently threatening active operations that protect American lives. Derek set down the phone, his hands shaking slightly. I was just trying to understand what my brother had been through. I wanted to know more about the sacrifices you made, the missions you completed. How is that threatening national security? Marcus explained the concept of compartmentalized information, how classified operations were designed so that even people with security clearances only knew what they needed to accomplish their specific missions. Derek's research was connecting dots that were supposed to remain separate, potentially revealing patterns that could compromise ongoing activities. The Medal of Honor I showed you represents one operation out of dozens that remain classified. The documents you saw contained names, dates, and locations that are still sensitive 20 years later. Your research is approaching information that could get current operatives killed if it falls into the wrong hands. Derek pushed back from his desk, the weight of unintended consequences settling over him. Marcus, I never meant to put anyone in danger. I was just proud of what you'd done, trying to understand the brother I'd wrongly accused of being a fraud. I know that, Derek. But intelligence agencies can't make exceptions based on good intentions. They have to assume that any unauthorized research into classified operations represents a potential security threat. The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus explaining the levels of security that governed his former life, while Derek grappled with the realization that his research had created federal surveillance of their entire family. By the end, Derek understood that his research needed to stop, but he also grasped the impossible position Marcus had been placed in for decades. So the choice is always between family relationships and national security? Derek asked. There's never a middle ground where you can have both? That's been my reality for 20 years. Every family gathering where I couldn't explain my absences, every holiday I missed because of operations, every question I couldn't answer because of classification levels. The work required sacrificing normal relationships to protect information that keeps other people safe. Derek closed his laptop, symbolically ending his research into his brother's classified service. I'll stop investigating Marcus. I'll tell Sarah to stop asking questions. But what do we tell the rest of the family? How do we explain that they need to forget what they learned at the wedding? We tell them the truth they can handle, Marcus replied. That some information is too dangerous to share, even within families. That the knowledge they have should be treated as a sacred trust that never gets discussed outside our immediate circle. The family meeting, held the following Sunday at their parents' house, was unlike any gathering in the Rivera family history. Marcus explained the security implications of the information they'd learned, while Derek supported his request for absolute discretion. Elena cried when she realized that even knowing about Marcus's service put her at potential risk. Uncle Roberto, with his military experience, understood immediately and volunteered to help ensure that other family members grasped the seriousness of the situation. Their mother, despite her age and declining health, proved to be the strongest advocate for maintaining operational security. Mijo, she told Marcus, you've protected us for 20 years by keeping secrets. Now it's our turn to protect you by keeping this secret. The agreement reached that day was comprehensive and solemn. The family would never discuss Marcus's classified service outside their immediate circle. They would not research his background or ask questions about his operations. They would treat the knowledge they'd gained as information that could be dangerous to possess and deadly to share. 3 months later, the security review concluded with Marcus retaining his clearance levels and the family surveillance being reduced to periodic monitoring. Derek had successfully redirected his investigative energies toward expanding his insurance business. Elena had found peace with understanding that some aspects of her brother's life would always remain mysterious. Uncle Roberto had become an unofficial family security officer, ensuring that younger relatives understood the importance of discretion. The Millbrook community gradually lost interest in the rumors about Marcus Rivera's military service, especially after Derek publicly stated that his earlier questions had been answered to his satisfaction. The VFW Post stopped asking for documentation of his service record. The local newspaper reporter found other stories to pursue. Marcus continued living in the same small apartment, working for the same government contractors, maintaining the same careful balance between civilian life and classified responsibilities. But the relationship with his family had fundamentally changed. They understood now that his distance hadn't been rejection, but protection. That his silence hadn't been indifference, but operational security. The Medal of Honor went back into the safe deposit box in Dallas, along with the other classified documents that represented a lifetime of service most Americans would never know about. But something had changed in the secrecy that surrounded it. Marcus's family now knew the truth, even if they couldn't discuss it. The weight of completely solitary service had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that people who mattered understood his sacrifices. A year after the wedding confrontation, Derek approached Marcus with a proposal that showed how much both brothers had learned from their conflict. He wanted to establish a foundation that would provide support for veterans dealing with the aftermath of classified service, people whose PTSD and readjustment challenges couldn't be addressed through traditional veteran support systems because their service couldn't be acknowledged publicly. "We can't talk about what you did," Derek explained, "but we can help other people who've done similar things. Veterans whose service was so classified that they can't even access normal VA benefits because their records don't exist in accessible databases." The Shadow Warriors Foundation, as it came to be known, operated with the same discretion that had governed Marcus's wife. It provided mental health support, financial assistance, and legal advocacy for veterans whose service existed in classified shadows. The funding came from
Anonymous donors who understood operational security, and the beneficiaries were people whose sacrifices would never be publicly recognized. Marcus served as an unofficial advisor to the foundation, using his networks within the intelligence community to identify veterans who needed help but couldn't ask for it through normal channels. Derek handled the administrative and legal aspects, applying his business skills to managing an organization that operated in the gray areas between public service and classified protection. The Foundation's first major success came when they helped a former Navy intelligence officer whose classified service had left her with PTSD, so severe that she couldn't hold civilian employment. Traditional veteran services couldn't help because her service record was too classified to verify through normal channels. The Foundation provided the specialized support she needed while protecting the operational security that kept her identity safe. 5 years after the wedding confrontation that had nearly destroyed their family, Marcus and Derek stood together at a private ceremony honoring veterans whose service could never be publicly acknowledged. The event was held in an unmarked building in Virginia, attended by fewer than 50 people whose own classified service records would never appear in official histories. The speaker was a retired intelligence director whose name most Americans would never learn, describing sacrifices made by people whose identities remained classified even in death. Marcus recognized several faces in the audience, operatives he'd worked with on missions that officially never happened, people whose own families probably didn't understand the true nature of their service. "The heroes we honored today," the director said, "served not for recognition, but for duty.
They understood that some service requires absolute sacrifice, including the sacrifice of being known for what you've done. They chose to protect their country in ways that made normal lives impossible, accepting isolation and secrecy as prices worth paying for national security. Derek listened with newfound appreciation for the community his brother belonged to, people whose service transcended traditional military categories. These were Americans who had chosen to serve in shadows so deep that their own families couldn't know their true contributions to national security. After the ceremony, Marcus and Derek walked together through Arlington Cemetery, stopping at graves marked only with names and dates, no mention of the classified operations that had cost these people their lives. Some of the headstones marked people Marcus had worked with, operatives whose deaths had been attributed to accidents or illnesses to protect the security of ongoing missions. "Do you ever regret it?" Derek asked as they stood before the grave of someone Marcus had served with in operations that would never be declassified. "Do you ever wish you'd chosen a different path? Something that would have allowed you to have a normal family life?" Marcus considered the question that went to the heart of every classified operative's existence. "Derek, the work I did prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of Americans. The networks we disrupted saved lives in ways that can never be quantified or acknowledged. The intelligence we gathered protected military units and diplomatic personnel in hostile territories." He paused, looking around the cemetery where so many classified heroes rested in unmarked honor. "Do I ever regret missing birthday parties and family dinners? Do I regret the relationships that couldn't develop because of security requirements? Of course. But I don't regret the service itself. Some missions are worth any personal sacrifice." Derek nodded, understanding finally penetrating years of resentment and confusion about his brother's choices. "I wish I had understood earlier, Marcus. I wish I hadn't spent so many years thinking you considered yourself too good for the family."
Just me, but other operatives and their families. The classification systems exist for reasons that go far beyond individual careers or recognition. Medal of Honor remained in its Dallas safe deposit box, a symbol of service that few would ever see but many benefited from. It represented not just Marcus's courage in one classified operation, but the ongoing commitment of Americans who chose duty over recognition, security over celebrity, service over self. In a world where heroes often sought publicity, Marcus Rivera and people like him found honor in anonymity, strength in secrecy, and purpose in protecting what they could never publicly claim to defend. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.